I feel something of an imposter standing before you today, speaking after four people who have genuine scholarly credentials to talk about aspects of Orlando Furioso. I cannot read Italian. I've read only the first 300 or 400 pages of Orlando Furioso in translation, and sampled a few of the later episodes in this enormous poem. And that was a long time ago. I discovered the poem in the process of writing Small World, which was published in 1984. Before that, Ariosto and Orlando Furioso were mere names to me that I came across in allusions in books, but I was very glad to discover it. The knowledge of the poem I gleaned was superficial, but it made a crucial contribution to the novel, which is why I was invited to speak here today. It's an example of what I call the iceberg effect in fiction. Readers of novels which contain convincing factual references to a particular subject often assume that these are only the tip of a much larger body, a mass of specialised knowledge which is hidden from sight, like the iceberg. But this is usually an illusion. More often than not, the novelist has used everything he knows about that subject, and a limited amount of research. There is no iceberg, there is only the tip. To explain how Ariosto contributed to the tip of Small World, I must tell you how the novel evolved. In the 1970s, I began to travel quite a lot on lecture tours in foreign countries sponsored by the British Council and to attend international conferences. These latter were invariably more fun than conferences in England, where you usually had to sleep and eat in university halls of residence when the students were on vacation. Abroad, you often stayed in hotels and ate in restaurants, and there was usually some tourist expedition arranged by the host, and there were usually parties and receptions in the evenings. So these events generated a kind of holiday mood in the participants, especially in those days when international conferences were a relatively novel feature of academic life. In the summer of 1979, I was invited to take part in two conferences which took place conveniently in quick succession. The first one was in the James Joyce Symposium in Zurich. The symposium is held every 2 years, usually in a city with some association with Joyce. Particularly strong in the case of Zurich, where he lived for many years, and timed to coincide with Bloomsday, the 16th of June, the day of the action of his masterpiece, Ulysses. I was amazed to find that the symposium had attracted well over 200 people. There was something exhilarating and also piquant in the spectacle of all these scholars from all over the world congregating like pilgrims in the city of Zurich to pay homage to a great writer, and at the same time arranging to dine out in the evenings or go jogging in the early mornings, or perhaps pairing off with some attractive member of the opposite sex with a common scholarly interest. From Zurich, I flew directly to Israel to another conference on narrative theory and poetic fiction, split between the universities of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and recognised several academic acquaintances there, some of whom had also been at the Joyce Symposium. I wrote in my diary, more and more I think that air travel has revolutionised the academic world, made it a global campus. I was adopting Marshall McLuhan's phrase, the global village, to describe a world shrunk in size by the speed and facility of modern communications. I added to that thought, possible novel there. And in the course of that trip, I decided my next project would be a novel about the global campus. It would have a lot of academic characters travelling around the world and interacting with each other in various locations. It would be humorous and satirical in tone. I decided to use a number of characters from my previous book, Changing Places, including the English lecturer Philip Swallow and the American Professor Maurice Zapp, and I soon invented several others belonging to different countries. But for a long time, I couldn't think of a narrative structure that could contain them all and provide them with any kind of unity in the narrative. In the notebook that I dedicated to this project. I inscribed one day a somewhat desperate possible answer to my question. Could some myth serve, as in Ulysses? I was thinking of the way Joyce used the story of Homer's Odyssey to give shape to the events of one day in the lives of several Dubliners in June 1904. And then I added, or the Grail legend. It involves a lot of different characters and long journeys. The Grail legend, the quest for the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, and its association with the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, that was in my mind at the time because I'd just been to see John Borman's rather exciting, if over-the-top film Excalibur. And that made me think of the folklorist Jessie Weston's book From Ritual to Romance, which T.S. Eliot acknowledged as a framework, source of inspiration for his most famous poem, The Wasteland. Weston argued that the Christian motivation of the knight's quest for a grail, the medieval and Renaissance chivalric romance, was a displaced and sublimated version of a more ancient fertility religion, centering on the myth of a king of a sterile kingdom, sometimes called the Fisher King. The more I thought about the romance tradition in English literature, from Malory and Edmund Spenser and the late plays of Shakespeare to the narrative poems of Keats and Tennyson, the more convinced I was I found the structural principle for my novel. Namely, a parallel between the knights of old, who travelled through the then-known world at extraordinary speed, sometimes assisted by mythical winged creatures like the hippogriff, of which we saw some wonderful illustrations just now. Jetting a parallel between them and modern scholars jetting around the globe to various exotic locations, members of both groups competing with each other for professional glory and also sometimes love. And I began to fill my notebook with ideas and scenes and situations which would play modern variations on the ancient or medieval motifs. The controversies provoked by the impact of structuralism and post-structuralism on traditional literary criticism seemed a promising equivalent for medieval combat and jousting. I invented a naive young lecturer from the west of Ireland called Perce McGarrigle, equivalent to the chaste Sir Percival in the Arthurian legend, who would fall in love with a beautiful but elusive young woman writing a PhD on romance and pursue her around the world. I thought that the Grail, which the more senior academics were seeking, might be a newly founded UNESCO chair in literary criticism with a huge salary and no duty. Somewhere there might be some venerable but impotent professor called Arthur Kingfisher who would be assessing the candidates. I got to about that stage in my preparation for writing this novel when one day I went into the university bookshop with no particular purchase in mind. I looked over the very small selection of new books of literary criticism which it had on its shelves. My eye fell on one called Inescapable Romance, Studies in the Poetics of the Moment, by Patricia Parker, a name not familiar to me. She was identified as Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. I glanced at the names of some of the authors discussed, including Ariosto, Spenser and Keats, bought the book instantly and carried it away. The chapter on Ariosto led me to buy another book as soon as possible, the translation of Orlando Furioso by Barbara Reynolds in the Penguin Classic series. And I soon realised that it was exactly the model of romance that I wanted. Not elegiac like the Mordartha, or earnestly didactic like Spenser's The Fairy Queen, or unbearably tedious to a modern reader like Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, but amusing, witty, sophisticated, and sexy. Those epithets would also apply to Byron's Don Juan, a poem I'd hugely enjoyed ever since I read it as an undergraduate, but which I'd never seen as belonging to the romance tradition in the manner of Ariosto, which of course it was. Barbara Reynolds began her introduction. Orlando Furioso is above all a poem to be enjoyed. The chief aim of its creator was to give delight, and that was what I hoped to do, delighting myself in the process. Writing Small World was, for me, a holiday from realism. The romance model, Ariosto's in particular, licensed me to make my large cast of characters meet and separate and meet again in various combinations by means of coincidences which would strain credulity in a conventional novel. By making my heroine a young woman writing a thesis on romance and always ready to talk about it, I hope to communicate some idea of the nature of this genre to readers who are not graduates in literature. But I also look for opportunities to insert allusions to Orlando Furioso for the minority who might recognise them and appreciate them. For example, Percy turned to address Angelica, but she disappeared. Was there ever such a girl for disappearing? He muttered to himself, as if she had a magic ring for that purpose. Or Ariosto's heroine has just such a ring. My Angelica tricks both Percy McGarrigle and a rather crass linguist called Dempsey into waiting vainly for her to turn up for an assignation. I was to go to bed and wait for her to come to me, said Dempsey, like Ruggiero and Alcina, she said. A couple of characters in one of those long eye-type poems about it. My heroine was not originally called Angelica. In the notebook, she's provisionally called Lily Paps, which was a poetic phrase for female breast in a stanza of the Fairy Queen, itself actually derivative from a passage by Ariosto, though I didn't know that until I read Patricia Parker's book. I found a more appropriate use for the name Lily Paps as the name of Angelica's dissolute twin sister, who causes much confusion and stress for Percy as he pursues her around the world. And I changed their surname from Paps to Paps. Ita tells me that there are two sets of twins in Orlando Furioso, but mine were not an intentional echo. Twins I read in Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism were a common feature of traditional romance, and that was what gave me the idea of including them in my story. The naughty twin, Lily Paps, was at times a striptease dancer, and striptease as both action and metaphor is a recurrent motif in Small World, which has analogies in Ariosto's poem. He was no feminist in the modern sense. He created many strong and admirable women characters, but he also enjoyed undressing them and describing their naked beauty in lyrical detail, though stopping short, as in traditional striptease, of the most intimate revelation. His description of Olympia, I saw a picture of her, chained naked to a rock and awaiting death by sea monster, extends over 3 ecstatically sensuous stanzas, but concludes, those other parts which to conceal she tries, I will, as it behoves in silence pass. Content to say that she, from top to toe, embodies all the beauty man can know. Patricia Parker, and my debt to her is acknowledged on the front of the prefatory note to Small World. She borrowed from the French critic Roland Barthes the idea of an erotic set of text, which she applied to, quote, the frustration in Ariosto of what Barthes calls readerly pleasure, the desire to penetrate veiled meaning or hasten the narrative's gradual striptease by a continual postponement of revelation. The metaphor of the striptease or dance of veils is one of the privileged images of modern semiology, for the succession of representations as an infinite regression of veils. This passage prompted me to compose the lecture called Sexuality as Striptease, which Maurice Zapp delivers to the scandal of his audience of rubbish content in the first chapter of Small World. If you visited the new library on our campus, you may have been surprised to see a quotation from his lecture inscribed on the wall of the main foyer. It was put there on the initiative of the Vice-Chancellor, Sir David Eastwood, who happens to be a fan of Small World. And it says, to read is to surrender oneself to an endless displacement of curiosity and desire from one sentence to another. I like to think that Ariosto would have agreed.